Hi, I'm Deb Seeley, and I'm going to attempt to give you an oral presentation on the author that I chose. Her name is Margaret Ryan. I will try to keep this brief, but I tend to run on, so I apologize in advance if this is a long video. Anyway, Margaret Ryan, she's in the book for her lecture that she wrote in 1797. Well, I'm not sure when she wrote it, but it was published in 1797 in A Compendious System of Astronomy. Just a really quick background. She was a teacher for an all-girls school. Hold on, I'm reading my notes here. You can probably see them in my glasses, so I apologize for that. She was a teacher in an all-girls school before opening her own schools for young women. She opened up two, one right after the other. The only images that I could find of her were of her and her two daughters, but in that image, there were all kinds of scientific apparatus in the picture with her and the girls. She was an astronomer and also a philosopher. So basically, being an educator was one of the few ways that a woman could go into the sciences at that point. It wasn't that long before this that women, the only way women could even get an education was to be a concubine, a courtier. So, it's not that far of a stretch that, she would want to teach school because, it's not like she could just, go down to, to Dow Chemicals and get a job. Women scientists weren't, really widely accepted at that point. Although at the beginning, or about the time she started publishing works, they were starting to be more women published with scientific journals and papers. So, and she may have very well been one of the influencers of that. So anyway, and another thing was to keep in mind that her relationship with God and science was almost the polar opposite of what it is today. Science was the new kid on the block at that point compared to religion and to religious studies of the time that would have encompassed all forms of religion, whether Hinduism or Islam or Judaism or Christianity. And given that she was from Great Britain, Christianity probably would have been the one that was in charge at that point, would have influenced more things, whichever denomination or branch was in power at that point, because make no mistake, the Christianity was greatly involved with who had the power at that point in time in our history. So anyway, let's see. At that point, though, any kind of science would have been compared to religion. It was kind of a given that God was the one that had made everything, and so every scientific discovery was weighed and measured against God and his creations at that point. So, and of course, now it's pretty much the polar opposite. Science, it was becoming more established at that time, but not so trusted. Now, in today's world, like I said, everything has advanced and it's almost become its own religion. It overshadows religion, and in some cases, that people use science to disprove God in their minds. It's kind of the general accepted thing. So, moving on, the key lines that I chose. Let's see if I can make this a little bit easier. I wish there was a way I could figure out how to make this easier for you guys to see too. Anyway, in the key lines I chose, the first one is in the third paragraph of lecture 1. We see Brian state, quote, we are conscious that our present existence was not the primary or principal intention of our Creator. That's on page 81 at the bottom. This is an important concept for modern readers of Brian's work, as well as other authors at that time, scientists and that type of thing. It's important that we keep that in mind because, as I said just a moment ago, it colors all that she does. Again, she measures everything she does against her belief that God is in control and has created everything that she's looking at. It's the belief that humans were created by a loving God with the sole purpose of eventually going to heaven, and that our time as flesh and blood creatures is temporary, and it's a preparation for the afterlife. And she mentions it because she believes that it's the foundation from which all interaction with your world should be based upon, and we should act accordingly. We should have reverence for the Creator and for the things that He's created. The second quote, the key line would be that Brian furthers this idea when she's, and then a couple paragraphs down, or actually the next paragraph, where she says that since we humans have, quote, superiority on the scale of beings, end quote, that's from page 181, that's where she's referring to the biblical standard of a hierarchy of God, angels, humans, animals. We're a little bit lower than angels, but we're definitely higher than animals. And the world, it's that idea that the world was created for us, and therefore we have, I can't think of the word, we are here to take control of animals and the world around us, and it's here for us. So she's saying that since we are used to all of we're supposed to use all of the things that God gives us, not only for our own survival, but also, quote, but also to derive considerable mental gratification from them, end quote. That's on page 182, which also sets a precedence for justification for all sorts of inquiry, including the sciences. It's kind of the concept of, well, we're in charge of all this, we should know about it. Which I think kind of is the bottom internalized driving force for all scientific inquiry, and really a lot of learning. That's my opinion, at least. My third key line is where she ends her lecture by extolling the gift of scientific inquiry and the learning in general. She writes, how delightful, quote, how delightful is the task of inquiry, how important the advantages resulting from investigations, end quote. That's from page 182 at the very end. She states that those that search for answers are, still working on my computer, are rewarded by the joy of searching and of learning and gaining knowledge from the world around us. And she finishes the whole lecture by stating that these joys and the world around us are gifts from God, and that it's important when reading work, and it's important for us when we read any work, and that would be any kind of work, whether it's literature or science or history, mostly really important with scientific writings and literature from this time period, because this is really the foundation that most of the work, whether they are embracing this concept of God being the creator of everything, or their drive to disprove that, which I think we see in at least a couple of the other readings that we've had. The name just has already slipped my mind of another one I just read, so I apologize for that. In any case, so when we talk about what I'm looking at as foundations for a graduate level paper, if I were to consider Margaret Ryan, I would think that this lecture she gave would provide several ideas for a graduate level paper. I chose her for this assignment because due to how closely she ties God and science together. If you haven't figured out by now, I'm Team God over here, and so I think that this could be expanded to compare and contrast, or contrast how the two are treated in modern times, versus back then. But I also think that a really great paper could be written on how she was a woman during a time, she was a woman scientist, a female scientist, at a time when women in the sciences were just starting to be accepted, and how she may have actually contributed to that acceptance. And, all female scientists from that point on, and even all of us women that maybe could have even considered a job in the sciences, we're standing on her shoulders and the shoulders of other women like her. She was, like I said earlier, she was a teacher at an all-girls school. And so how many hundreds of minds did she teach? And how many people was she an inspiration to? We will probably never know. So women like her, women of that time, they definitely influenced the future for women in the sciences. And so for my final part of this would be the quote that I'm supposed to examine. I had a hard time with this because I kind of agree with everything she's written. That's just my perspective, and I understand it's not probably a common one, but it's mine. So I'm choosing this little bit from the middle of the lecture. She writes, and this is on page 182, she writes, "Before entering upon this important investigation, my duty prompts me to offer some reflections on that hand which formed us, that divine mind which directs our involuntary operations, and that benevolence which renders these operations instrumental to the comfort and happiness of all its creatures." So she's saying, before I even go into the rest of this lecture, we need to look at God, the person that created us. And then in the very next paragraph, she seems to contradict herself, where she says, "Yet how can I presume to recount the works of the Almighty or show the wisdom of his counsels?" It was a rhetorical question, but she still does go on to write about it. So I found that kind of interesting, and I think it's a question that it may not actually contradict itself. It just kind of seems to. I had a hard time finding anything that looked a certain way but actually was contradictory, and that may be short-sightedness on my part, but I think that's probably the closest I can come. And so she's really not saying, we need to look at it, but I can't. She's saying, we need to look at it, but it's such an amazing and immense undertaking that, how could we even begin to do that? And then also, I think too, she's also saying that, we need to be humble, and she's thinking they, need to be humble in how, they look at God's hand in their life. They don't want to be too full of themselves, which I think is something we've lost sight of in modern science. But, I admit to being prejudiced in that way. So, anyway, so I have some questions to ask you, my fellow students, and I will go ahead and write these on my post as well. So my first question is, do you see, when you read this paper, when you read this little bit of this lecture, do you feel like there's a huge contradiction in how we look at sciences now? And my second question would be, did the works that you read, did you see the same kind of intermeshing of religion and everyday life in what you read? So if so, either answer either one or answer both, whichever you prefer to do, but those are my questions for you. And I hope that I covered everything in this lecture to your satisfaction. If you have any questions for me, please do not hesitate to write them down. So thanks for listening, and I appreciate your time. Bye. God bless.